This is HuffPost Live. I'm Mike Sachs. Canada's sudden move last week to close its embassy in Iran seems to cut against the country's image as the United States' more conciliatory cousin. But in reality, while Michael Moore and other Liberals were busy extolling Canada's universal health care system, our northern neighbour's government was growing more and more conservative in foreign policy. We have an all-star Canadian hangout here to discuss the roots of this shift and why Americans should take notice. We have Althea Raj, a politics reporter with HuffPost Canada, joining us from Ottawa. We have Chris Berube. Chris, am I pronouncing that right? Berube?
That's close enough. I'll take Berube.
Berube, okay. So Chris Berube, an editor and writer, taking leave from his home country to study here in New York. I think that's correct.
That's correct.
Yes, good. And we have JJ McCullough. McCullough.
Yes.
McCullough, all right. A freelance media critic joining us from Vancouver. And we have Taufiq Rahim, a Dubai-based political analyst who was born and raised in Vancouver. So, Althea, I want to go to you first. Last I checked in, given that I am a typical American, last I checked in with Canada and its foreign policy, they weren't joining us in Iraq around 2003, 2004, 2005. What's happened since? I know that they took some. I think Ann Coulter in 2005 said, "Yeah, Canadians are with us or came with us in Vietnam. They're a bunch of wussies for not joining us in Iraq." And someone said, "No, they weren't with us in Vietnam." With that spat in my head, I was surprised to hear about some of the more robust foreign policy that Canada's been having since 2006.
Well, they elected a conservative government in 2006 that had a minority until last year in 2011 when they finally won a majority of the seats in our House of Commons, which is our parliament. We had a majority conservative government that was sort of unfettered, if you wish. So there were a couple of steps that we did notice, definitely on the foreign policy stance, much more pro-Israel stance right from the beginning. Now we, along with the United States and about 5 other small island Pacific nations that I had never heard of before I worked at the UN, are voting in favor of just very pro-Israel resolutions, or rather against, pro-Palestinian resolutions, if you would say. And then, of course, Friday, Canada took the bold step of closing down its embassy in Tehran and booting Iranian diplomats who have until the end of the day, I think, to actually get out of the country.
Now, was there any prologue to this? It seems to be a pretty rash decision.
Well, Canada and Iran have a very, very testy relationship that goes back years. We always fight amongst each other at the UN. They bring in a resolution saying that we are anti-human rights, and we bring in resolution saying that they're anti-human rights. But just beyond that, the sort of escalating rhetoric, what we saw, especially because of our staunch support for Israel now, was definitely a sort of the tone of the discussion being raised. And there was a concern from the government that when they wanted to speak as boldly as they had in the past, that they would be endangering staff at the mission in Iran. So they decided to get rid of the staff that were there to essentially to assure their safety. So they could go out and say, Iran is the biggest threat to world peace right now.
So Chris, tell me, you're hearing all this. You're Canadian. You've chronicled some of these things. Tell me what you're thinking about what Althea just recounted.
Well, the Iran case is very interesting because I think what's confusing a lot of people is the timing of it. A lot of people aren't really sure why Canada is withdrawing from Tehran right now.
Right.
As opposed to, we've had incidents in the past, such as, I believe it was 2003, that a Canadian citizen was killed in Iran under very unusual circumstances.
And from 80 to 88, the Tehran embassy was closed, right?
That's right, yeah. So it's interesting that we have cut ties right now. The reasons that I've heard that I find credible as to why this move was made when it was are that Canadian foreign policy towards Syria, and specifically this is seen as a proactive move to support, to be against the Syrian regime, and also just that this is thought as a way to influence the Iranian election that's happening next year. Of course, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, under Iranian law, cannot run for another term, and the thought is that if Canada withdraws, then possibly other countries will withdraw, and that could possibly have some kind of an effect on what happens next year.
So there's something interesting I'm hearing between the lines of what you just said. In the U.S., we often complain about how we're not really doing anything with Syria. We're kind of saying you must stop what you're doing. but we're kind of hamstrung from Iraq and other engagements from actually going in and leading something there, right? There are people calling for intervention, or people at least calling for a more broader or a more broad response to what's going on there. But we're tied up with certain economic ties, we're tied up with certain historical ties that prevent us from having a more robust response. Does Canada have any of those same ties? Do they have to worry about Russia and China to the same extent we do? Do they have to worry about I guess, expending capital that the U.S. has spent in the last decade?
Yeah, I mean, Canada's capital has largely been tied up in Afghanistan, which has been kind of our primary theater of conflict over the last few years. And most of Canada's military resources have been directed towards being involved in the conflict there, meaning that, I mean, the Canadian military is a very small fraction of the size of America's military power, both in terms of just the pure number of people we can send and equipment. And frankly, a lot of Canada's military hardware is very much out of date. So in terms of how much we can engage, the fact that we are still drawing down in Afghanistan means that Canada really cannot commit more than sort of support in terms of finances or in terms of political support when it comes to something like the Syrian conflict right now.
And the U.S. doesn't really have any embassy to pull out of in Iran. So we really have no more symbolic move to take there than the sanctions we're leading on. But JJ, I see an American flag back there. Is that in solidarity for us for 9/11, or do you have that constantly flying in the background?
Well, I do, and I'm a conservative Canadian. I support this present government that we have, and I think that something like the American flag is perhaps more revealing than I intended. But it's important to understand is that there is a conservative tradition in this country, as much as there is kind of this idea in America that Canada is this kind of liberal, progressive utopia. There is a very strong conservative tradition in this country that is very influenced by the United States, that takes a lot of cues from the conservative traditions of the United States. And one of the things that's interesting about this current government is Prime Minister Stephen Harper, is that before he was elected in 2006, he was a very strong supporter of the Iraq War. He was a very sort of classical, what Americans would call a neocon. He was very supportive of the idea that we have to take a very hard line against Islamist rogue regimes around the world. We have to take a very strong line against terrorism. There is regime change as a desirable option. And, Israel is our most stalwart ally in the Middle East, and we should have a foreign policy that recognizes that and supports her whenever she's challenged from other nations. And so I think that it's important to understand that, like all democratic societies, Canada swings from right to left, depending on how elections go and which party is in power. And I think that it's important that we not sort of read too much into this being a horrible deviation or a rejection of what Canada is supposed to be, and more of a sort of natural swing that I think all countries experience to some form or another.
Right, and you mentioned something that sounded similar to what Andy Green, 1987, said in the comments as we were waiting to get going before. I wouldn't put it past the Canadian people to buy into the rhetoric used so heavily in American politics. Is Canadian politics really all influenced by what goes on south of the border here?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Canadians and Americans are so similar, so culturally similar. We speak the same language. We read the same books, frankly. We go to very similarly structured universities. We study the same thinkers. I read lots of American pundits. Lots of Canadian liberals read prominent American liberal pundits. Our political culture is really very, very similar in terms of the broad theories, the broad sort of prisms that people use to analyze world events. And so what I'm saying is that sort of the Canadian right has been very influenced by the sort of rhetoric and the sort of conclusions that we've seen in the United States. It's not to say that, Canada is simply a puppet state of America, or that the Canadian right is simply a puppet of the Republican Party, as is sometimes alleged by our friends on the left. But yeah, we have reached broadly similar conclusions that I think are a product of our very similar political philosophies and political culture.
Taufiq, you're over out in Dubai, but you are Canadian. Tell me what you're thinking about what we've been talking about here so far.
Well, I mean, this conservative government is a growing embarrassment to foreign policy principles in general, and also defending Canadian values and projecting an image of Canada that actually benefits most Canadians. And I find it shocking to hear what the last commentator just said, that somehow this is part of some natural extension. Let's be perfectly frank here. The Canadian government did not join the Vietnam War. The Canadian government established relations with Fidel Castro. The Canadian government in 1979 and 80, under the leadership of conservatives, it kept the embassy in Iran open and helped actually different kidnapped Americans to safety.
And then immediately
so,
closed, though, right? I mean, it closed once those Americans were safely delivered back to the U.S.
Well, you have to remember that it was in the 1980s. We're in the context of a war between Iran and Iraq, but Canada kept its embassy open and under much more dire circumstances. Today, when we're talking about Zahra Kazemi was killed, we have 2 Canadians inside Iranian prisons. It does a complete disservice to Iranian Canadians who are under threat in Iran itself, to the 120,000 Iranian Canadians that travel back and forth, to Iranians who are trying to get out of Iran itself. There really is nothing that's benefited anybody in Canada from the move by the government. I'll be honest with you. This is a government that Avigdor Lieberman, the foreign minister of Israel, calls its best friend in the world. It's a government that is not governing on foreign policy with the pulse of Canadians, because most Canadians, to be perfectly honest, are apathetic about these type of issues. This is not what's going to decide elections. This is why the Conservatives won a majority in 2011. But I'm sure one day people are going to wake up, go around the world, and the image of Canada as a peacemaker, the image of Canada as an inclusive nation is deteriorating in the world, and is deteriorating in the Middle East, where people come up to me and ask me what has happened to Canada. And frankly, I can chart out what has happened, but my answer is also, I don't know. Because there are people who are in this government that are pursuing a policy, an agenda that's divorced from the electorate and that's catering to special interests in the country.
But those people were voted in by someone, right? The government was voted in by...
Like I said, so this is in countries where voters are apathetic about certain issues. So elections are not going to be decided in Canada at this moment about foreign policy. It's special interests that are playing the influencing role. And I'm hopeful that over time people will wake up, but it might be too late, because it might be you come out in the world and the Canadian values of not just even-handedness, but inclusive foreign policy, of deliberative foreign policy, will have disappeared. And I think then it will become an election issue. And I'm hoping the media is a little bit more penetrating on these type of things. But even just judging from the discourse I've just heard, there's no basis in the Israel-Canada alliance more than the Canadian alliance with a Palestinian democracy. That's a myth that's being perpetrated out of the right-wing and evangelical establishment in the United States. It has no fundamental or popular basis. Nobody in Canada wakes up in the morning and goes, well, Israel's my natural democratic ally.
Well, perhaps not on the Canadian left, but on the Canadian right, that's absolutely a big principle. The Canadian right very much. Well, because
Which Canadian right? The new Canadian right or the old Canadian right?
Well, I mean, I can't speak to sort of when Prime Minister Mulroney won the Conservative Party nomination back in the 1980s, in his acceptance speech, he acknowledged that Canada's four closest allies in the world are Britain, France, America, and Israel. Like, this is a long tradition in Canadian foreign policy. And, even you go back to, like, supposedly the heyday of sort of Canadian progressivism, Prime Minister Lester Pearson was a strong supporter of the Zionist experiment in Israel.
Lester B. Pearson was the Canadian Nobel Peace Prize winner that helped resolve the Suez crisis by being an even-handed broker, a role that a Canadian former Prime Minister could no longer play.
And the key thing about that was that what troubled Prime Minister Pearson was the idea that the Western alliance was divided in its support of Israel, that the French and the British and the Israelis were on different sides of that issue. That was what troubled him, not this idea that, the Israelis are no better than the Egyptians or what have you. It's what you said before with the whole idea of Canada and Vietnam. Like, we were not engaged combat wise in Vietnam War, but we had no love lost for the communists. We actually supported the United States militarily through weapons construction.
Right. So it's one thing to not have love lost for Saddam Hussein. It's another thing to invade Iraq and throw the country into chaos. I think everybody would be standing with Israel's security in Canada, I included, but we're going to also, want to stand on both sides of the issue on promoting Palestinian rights as well. Let me just take your example of this current government and Israel. In the G8 summit held last year, when Barack Obama, no less, tried to forward language on a two-state solution. It was our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who undermined a joint statement coming out of the G8 that wasn't partisan, that wasn't on the side of any of the Palestinians or the Israelis, but jointly supported a two-state solution along the 1967 lines. And this Prime Minister eschewed a permanent position of Canadian foreign policy towards Palestine since 1967, that a resolution in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict would be based on 1967 borders. That's not going along with Canadian foreign policy. It's also contravening the American foreign policy. It's completely radical.
Chris, you've been quite polite, but I've seen several times you have that intake of breath so you can start exhaling words.
Well, this is actually building on a point that Taufiq made a bit earlier, which is talking about how Canadian foreign policy has kind of been not an election issue for the last fairly long time. And it's true, in the last election, it seemed like the only foreign policy concern that was coming up was withdrawal from Afghanistan, which all of the parties broadly, but with a little bit of kind of minute disagreement, more or less agreed on, which was we're getting out of Afghanistan soon, that's still going to go forward as planned. So it's interesting that our foreign policy conversation in terms of electoral politics has been very similar to what I've seen at the RNC and DNC this last week, which was we really aren't talking about it at all. We really aren't talking about what kind of engagement is happening. And we've seen that the Conservative government has taken a bit more of a free hand in terms of especially climate agreements, things like that internationally, because there is a sense that these are not issues that really are moving a lot of voters in Canada. Right, and so, I'm afraid I have to check out, but yeah.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah.
Oh, come on. Just a little bit longer.
Okay, I'll say a little bit longer.
Thank you. Althea, so what's in it for Canada then? What's in it for the Harper's government, for the Conservative government? If really, is it just geopolitical positioning? I just don't understand. If there's no base, if there's no political movement, if there's only voter apathy towards these positions they're taking in foreign affairs, do they sense daylight that they can move into where the U.S. has backed out of? I just don't understand what politically is at stake here. Why?
Well, it doesn't move a huge chunk of voters, but it does play to their base, right? And obviously, Canada, like the United States, the Jewish community is a very wealthy community, gives a lot of money to the Conservative Party. Maybe at the outset, I think a lot of people felt that that's why the government was moving in that direction. I think now we're seeing it's actually part of their worldview. But there's something that you mentioned a little bit earlier on that I think that it's important for viewers to understand, that in Canada, you can obtain a majority government without actually having the support of the majority of Canadian voters. So the Harper government has the support of about 40% of Canadians, or at least they had at the last election. That's not the majority of Canadians. So 60% of people voted for a party that is either more centrist or more left-wing than this government actually is.
Right, so how did they collect the coalition then to have a governing majority within Parliament?
Well, they don't have a coalition. They just
plurality.
They obtain the majority of the seats in the House of Commons. They get to have a majority government. So that's what happened. But in terms of popular vote, more Canadians voted for something else than for this government.
But I mean, go ahead, Chris.
Oh, yeah, well, it's a system that's possible when, like Canada, you have 4 or 5 competitive national parties instead of one competitive national party. So what happens is that votes get split at the riding level, which is kind of like the constituency level in the United States. And as a result, somebody could win like 30% of the vote and win the seat. And if you just add up enough of those seats, that's what happens. And with the when you were asking the question of what's in it for the Conservatives, Canada is very much like the United States in that swing votes matter more than anything else. And particularly for the Conservatives, the way they were able to win their majority is they targeted suburban neighborhoods that were around Toronto, which were primarily Jewish, some suburban neighborhoods which were primarily new immigrants as well, and they were very aggressive in their policy to cater to new immigrants to Canada. And that's how you win elections. It's kind of the same way as in the United States. You have a targeted specific message that reaches a small number of people, but a small group who are actually malleable in terms of who they vote for. And I'm sorry, farewell. Have a good discussion.
Okay, Chris. Well, thanks for joining.
Take care. Thanks for having me.
So I heard especially from Taufiq about this loss of the sense of a conciliatory cousin of America, right? That has generally the same worldview, the same outlook, but engages with the world in a way that perhaps the U.S. is unable to do because of its own electoral politics, engages in the world, and perhaps because it also has a less militarized foreign policy in a more moderate way, in a way that perhaps still favors U.S. and Canada and the alliance and our alliance and our foreign policy, but does it in a way that doesn't railroad other interests. That's just kind of the sense that I had. And what I'm seeing here is that perhaps there's a following in the footsteps now, a moving where the U.S. doesn't have the political capital to do so anymore, based on similar electoral currents. But we're also talking about a parliamentary and a coalition type government, and I have and a bunch of parties at play. And I have a comment here in the comment section from Nima A. Mike, I hope you balance this debate with talking about the rise of the New Democrats. The left of center party has been in the opposition for a year now. So what does this party represent?
So, I mean, if I could just chip in there, I mean, I think what we've seen, especially in the last few years and in the 2011 election, was not just a rise and a really solidification of this new conservative movement, but really an erosion and hollowing out of the Liberal Party, which had ruled for, about a decade, starting with Jean Chrétien and then into Paul Martin. And in the erosion of the kind of Canadian center-left, you really had the emergence of the NDP. And the New Democrat Party, which has been kind of the strong left, union-based left in Canada, and it's where universal healthcare came out under Tommy Douglas, Kiefer Sutherland's grandfather many decades ago. They capitalized on the erosion of the traditional Liberal Party and also dissatisfaction in Quebec, where there's obviously a large number of Canadians represented in Parliament, and they ended up taking seats from people who didn't want to support the separatist Bloc Québécois or the Conservative Party. So it's really now people are waiting to see what is this New Democrat Party going to represent. But traditionally, Canada has gravitated towards center-left and center-right parties. And what we have now is a more hardline left and a more hardline right setup. And I think in that case, I would agree with JJ that our political framework is gravitating more towards the American dynamic, much to the detriment, I think, of political discourse in Canada and reasonable policy making in Canada.
JJ.
Oh.
Do you agree with that characterization?
I think, as I said before, I think that there is a tendency that Canadians on the left, and sort of egged on by Americans on the left, there's this kind of tendency to imagine that there was this great sort of utopian time in Canada in which we were all good left of center moderates. We all thought exactly the same things about foreign policy and healthcare and taxes and the welfare state and all this kind of thing. And the fact is this universe just never existed. Canada is a democracy like any other. And when the left has been in power, there's been virulent opposition to it from the right. And now that the right's in power, there's virulent opposition to it from the left. And the thing that makes Canada a distinctive country, though, is that the left, and I suppose this is one of the biggest differences between Canada and the United States, is that in Canada, the left really drapes itself with the flag of patriotism. To be a patriotic, good Canadian is to be a leftist, to be a liberal, to support the Liberal Party, or to a lesser extent to support the NDP. And there's a sense that sort of to be a right-wing Canadian is almost borderline treasonous. Like it's almost like you're supporting bad ideas that are not Canadian ideas, like you're disgracing our country's proud progressive past, which, as I've said, has never really existed. If you look at the facts of these policies that the Liberal Party has pushed through with their decades in power, you'll find that there was always strong opposition to them from the right. And oftentimes that these policies were not quite as liberal as they are now imagined to be. As I said, our policies in Vietnam, for instance, were much more nuanced than is popularly imagined today. Our policies in Iran during the revolution were more nuanced than they are today. Even our policies towards Cuba, which is often held up as this great shining example of Canadian independence in the face of, American right-wing belligerence. I mean, part of the reason why we maintained relations with the Castro government was because it would be easier to help Americans spy on him. So, I mean, I think that it's important that we not get trapped in these narratives that Canada has sort of lost a fundamental part of itself, but rather that Canada, just like America, goes back and forth, and you have two camps that think very differently about very profound questions. That doesn't mean that one is less or more patriotic than the other.
I'm sorry, JJ, could you remind me what happened with the relationship with Castro between conservative and liberal governments? Because you said it goes back and forth. So did they cut off relations, then reestablish them, and then cut them off and then reestablish them?
No, but I mean, you know as well as I do that the Harper government has taken a hard line against the Castro government since they've been in power.
So exactly. So you're reinforcing the point that I'm making. That is this government that's particularly taking a different and markedly different path than previous governments.
Well, I think that this is the most genuinely conservative government we've had in some time. But I think that even then, the Mulroney government still wasn't nearly as fawning. I mean, you won't see Fidel Castro be a pallbearer at Brian Mulroney's funeral the way you saw him be a pallbearer at Pierre Trudeau's funeral.
That's fine. I mean, I have no love lost for Fidel Castro and the murderous actions of his regime. But Canada's policy is not to be left in the world. It's to engage in the world. It's, in fact, in Iran, not to be there to be a friend of the regime, but precisely even to have intelligence, to observe. I mean, that our role is to be engaged in so many different environments. In Afghanistan, we weren't there in just a handing out flowers role. We had forces. And it's not a characterization of the left or the right, that one is militaristic and one is, a dovish. But it's about being involved, being open-minded, being inclusive, not being xenophobic, which is what I think an undercurrent in a lot of the current new Conservative Party's platform. And that's what makes, I think, many people say, is this Canadian or not Canadian? Not the fact that you're supporting left or right-wing actions.
Well, guys, we have a comment from John Shaw, which reflects something that Taufiq had said earlier. Why does this dichotomy always have to emerge, pro-Israel versus pro-Arab? Apparently, this is reflecting what you said. Apparently, the previous prime minister helped broker a deal revolving around the Suez Canal crisis. Not too shabby. It's this nuance, JJ, that you were talking about. It's this honest brokering that you were talking about, Taufiq, that I guess the Iran embassy pullout had sort of jarred away the sense of the honest brokering and the nuance that we've come to expect from our northern neighbors. But Althea, I want to end with you. We're going to throw this back to the comments section in a moment. But given all this conversation, zooming out about 30,000 feet, what do we see happening in Canadian politics in the next couple of years as your own parliamentary elections approach?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that's sort of been omitted from the discussion is that it's not just a move on the right in terms of foreign policy, but just domestic policy as well. I mean, we're seeing a lot of criminal reforms, mandatory minimum sentences. We're moving to a system that's much closer to what the U.S. resembles. On immigration, we're jailing asylum seekers without review. We've wiped out a complete backlog of immigrants and saying we want people to reapply, and we're really focusing on what their labor skills are. This is not about, bringing your grandmother and your spouse who has no skills back to the country. So we are definitely going to see a move to the right that probably we won't begin to experience for a couple of years. And that will have definitely an impact when we have our next federal elections in 2015.
Well, Thea, thank you for that zoom out take on what's going on over there. Hopefully we'll get to talk about those domestic policies soon enough. Guys, all three of you, and Chris, who exited early, thank you for joining. This is HuffPost Live. The conversation does not end. It will continue.